My father spoke just one sentence during dinner on the 23rd of December, and it shattered our wealthy family. The best gift this family could get is if you vanished. By morning, his grand Christmas party was paralyzed, and his legacy estate was slipping away. The final blow came on Christmas Eve when I proved to the elites who truly ran this empire. Their nightmare was not losing money. It was surviving without the silent savior they discarded. My name is Reese Woodward, and for 34 years, I believed that loyalty could buy love. It was the evening of the 23rd of December, and the air inside Magnolia Row was thick with the scent of cinnamon, roasting meats, and a suffocating chill that no fireplace could warm. Magnolia Row was our ancestral home in Ashby Harbor, South Carolina, a sprawling estate of ancient oaks and columned porches that whispered of old money and Southern aristocracy. Tonight, it was the stage for our private family dinner, the quiet prelude to the grand Christmas Eve charity gala scheduled for the following night. I sat at the far end of the mahogany dining table, exactly where I always sat. It was the furthest point from my father, Everett Woodward, who presided at the head like a monarch holding court. To my left sat my younger brother, Nolan, swirling his wine with an inherited arrogance. To my right, my stepmother, Lenora, picked at her salad, her diamonds catching the low light. The room was a masterpiece of curated elegance. A faint jazz melody drifted from a vintage record player, blending with the clink of heavy antique silver against fine china. A massive imported pine tree dominated the corner, dripping with heirloom glass ornaments. The wine in our glasses was a rare vintage. The tablecloth beneath our plates was hand-embroidered silk, and the guest list for tomorrow night's gala resting on the sideboard represented the pinnacle of the city's elite. To the outside world, this was the Woodward legacy. Everett Woodward was a titan of historical real estate restoration, the man who preserved the soul of Ashby Harbor. Nolan was his golden heir, the charismatic face of the future. And I was just Reese, the quiet one, the one who worked behind a desk doing things no one in this room cared to understand. What the outside world did not know, and what my family willfully chose to ignore, was that every single beautiful thing in this room was anchored by my silent labor. The antique silver had been polished by staff whose salaries I secretly supplemented. The imported pine tree was purchased on a credit line I had guaranteed. The rare wine flowed because I had quietly settled the vendor accounts that my father had let slip into default. The very roof over our heads remained ours only because my financial maneuvering kept the bank at bay. I was the invisible scaffolding holding up a crumbling monument. Everett tapped his crystal goblet with a silver spoon. The sharp, clear chime cut through the jazz. He stood slowly, smoothing the lapels of his custom-tailored suit. His hair was perfectly silvered, his posture impeccable. He was a man built for making speeches. "To family," Everett began, raising his glass. His voice was a rich, practiced baritone that commanded the room. "And to the Woodward legacy, tomorrow night, we show Ashby Harbor what it means to preserve history. We show them strength, vision, and the enduring power of our name." He turned his gaze toward Nolan. The warmth in my father's eyes was genuine, a stark contrast to the performative charm he usually wore. "Nolan, my boy, you have shown remarkable instinct this year. You are the worthy successor of Woodward Heritage Build. You have the fire, the vision, and the natural leadership this family requires to move into the next century." Nolan smiled, a practiced, humble dip of his head that did not quite hide the smug satisfaction in his eyes. He raised his glass to our father. "It takes more than just keeping the lights on to build an empire," Everett continued, pacing slowly behind his chair. His tone shifted, growing sharper, colder. He did not look at me yet, but I felt the crosshairs settling on my chest. "It takes boldness. It takes men willing to take risks, to stand on the front lines, to shake hands and make the hard calls. It is not about hiding behind closed doors." He stopped pacing. His eyes finally met mine down the length of the long table, The warmth was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, hollow resentment. He resented me because he needed me, and a man like Everett Woodward could not stomach needing his quiet, unremarkable daughter. "Some people," Everett said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that carried perfectly in the quiet room, "think that playing with fancy spreadsheets makes them essential. They think that risk analysis and financial structures are the lifeblood of a legacy. They forget their place. They forget that they are merely the help, operating under the umbrella of a great name." I kept my face perfectly still. I did not look away. My heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I had endured years of passive-aggressive remarks, of being overlooked, of being treated as an infinite, unfeeling resource, but tonight was different. There was a finality in the air. The heavy scent of pine and roast duck suddenly made me nauseous. Everett raised his glass higher, looking directly into my eyes. The candlelight flickered across his face, casting sharp, cruel shadows. "The best gift this family could get is if you vanished." The words dropped onto the table like stones. The jazz record seemed to skip a beat. The fire in the hearth snapped loudly. Then, there was nothing but dead. Crushing silence. 1 second passed, then 2, then 5. I waited. I waited for Lenora to gasp, to reach out and touch his arm, to say, "Everett, you cannot say such things to your daughter." She did not. She carefully folded her linen napkin and stared fixedly at her plate. I waited for Nolan to at least pretend to object, to play the role of the peacemaker. Instead, from the corner of my eye, I saw his lips twitch. He offered a half smile, a subtle, sharp curve of his mouth that told me everything. He was not surprised. He was relieved. Father had finally said out loud what they all had been thinking for years. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It was in that silence that the last frayed string tying me to this family finally snapped. I realized, with a clarity so bright it was almost blinding, that the pain blooming in my chest was not from my father's words. I knew he was a cruel man. I knew he did not love me. No, the true agony, the unbearable weight of the moment, came from the silence of the room. It was the silence of parasites who had grown so accustomed to the host's blood that they resented the host for having veins. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs. I did not blink. I looked around the room, seeing it not as my home, but as a ledger. I looked at the silver platter holding the roast. $4,000. Paid from my personal contingency account last Tuesday to keep the caterer from walking out. I looked at the imported pine tree. $1,200, charged to a credit card in my name because Everett's limits were maxed. I looked at the crystal glass my father was still holding. I had negotiated the settlement that prevented the estate liquidators from taking those very glasses 3 years ago. I looked at the guest list for the Christmas Eve gala. A list of politicians, investors, and socialites who were only attending because they believed the Woodward name was financially sound. A fiction I maintained through relentless, exhausting financial acrobatics. They hated me. They wanted me gone. They viewed my contribution not as a sacrifice, but as a tedious obligation. My father's words were a declaration of war, but their silence was the execution. I did not cry. My eyes were entirely dry. I did not argue. What was there to debate? I did not slam my fists on the table or scream about how much they owed me. The time for seeking their approval was dead, buried under the weight of my father's toast. Instead, I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. It was a sensation of absolute control. I placed my napkin on the table, carefully smoothing out the creases. The fabric was soft against my fingertips. I pushed my heavy oak chair back. It scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The only sound in the frozen room. I stood up. I was not a tall woman, but in that moment, I felt like a towering shadow. I looked down the length of the table at my father, whose face remained a mask of arrogant disdain. I looked at Lenora, still refusing to meet my eyes. I looked at Nolan, whose smirk had faded slightly. replaced by a flicker of uncertainty at my calm demeanor. I smiled. It was a very small, private smile. It did not reach my eyes. It was the smile of an architect examining a building slated for demolition. "Merry Christmas, Father," I said softly. My voice was completely steady. I turned my back on the grand dining room, on the antique silver, on the rare wine, and on the people who shared my blood but nothing else. I walked toward the heavy double doors leading to the grand foyer. My footsteps echoed sharply in the quiet house. As I climbed the heavy mahogany stairs to my bedroom, leaving the suffocating silence of the dining room behind me, the physical weight of my secret life pressed down on my shoulders. For years, I had navigated the halls of Magnolia Row as a ghost, to the politicians, the socialites, and the journalists of Ashby Harbor. I was merely Everett Woodward's quiet, unremarkable daughter. I was the spinster who lived at home, the dull backdrop to my father's brilliant social canvas. They saw a woman who lacked the Woodward charisma. What they did not see was the architect who kept the ceiling from collapsing on their heads. During the daylight hours, far from the suffocating antique charm of my family's estate, I was the chief risk architect at Alder Axis Risk. It was a massive data infrastructure and disaster valuation firm. My job was not about aesthetics or historical preservation. It was about the brutal, unforgiving mathematics of catastrophe. I sat in a high-rise office made of glass and steel, designing damage prediction models, engineering emergency cash flow protocols, and structuring massive financial bailouts for coastal restoration projects. When a Category 4 hurricane threatened to wipe out 3 years of development on the eastern seaboard, corporate boards paid my firm millions to hear me tell them exactly how to stop the bleeding. I dealt in standard deviations, catastrophic loss variables, and impenetrable legal safeguards. I was ruthless in my assessments. Yet, when I drove through the iron gates of my family home, I surrendered all that power for the desperate hope of belonging. The irony was sickening. Billed to the public, my father's company, Woodward Heritage Build, was the undisputed symbol of tradition, high class, and historical integrity in our city. Everett Woodward was a master of the grand gesture. He hosted ribbon-cutting ceremonies with mayors and gave sweeping, emotional interviews about preserving the architectural soul of the South. The reality behind that polished mahogany facade was a terrifying, rotting ship painted gold. Everett was a man addicted to the performance of wealth, utterly blind to the mechanics of it. Over the last decade, Woodward Heritage Build had stood on the absolute brink of catastrophic bankruptcy more times than I could count. My father routinely took on flashy, high-profile renovation projects that were fundamentally uninsurable. When the hurricane seasons hit harder than expected, his sites flooded. When he ignored labor regulations to cut corners, the contract lawsuits piled up, spanning 3 different states. To cover the bleeding, he signed desperate bridge loans with predatory interest rates hovering around 19%, just to fund the imported marble for lobbies that no one had even leased yet. He chased deals that were aggressively, foolishly beyond his actual financial capacity. He would have lost it all 8 years ago if I had not intervened. That was when my second, entirely invisible life began. I utilized my expertise to establish a private limited liability company, layering the ownership behind blind trusts and corporate registrations so my name would never appear on a public ledger. Through that shell entity, I became the silent, desperate lung-breathing life into my father's drowning empire. It started small, a missed vendor payment here, a minor legal settlement there. But his incompetence was a bottomless pit. Soon, I was quietly wiring funds to pay the property taxes for Magnolia Row, a sum exceeding $120,000 a year, just to keep the county from seizing our ancestral home. When the liability insurance for his active construction sites lapsed, threatening to shut down his entire operation overnight, I paid the exorbitant premium penalties from my own savings. I covered the administrative payroll when his corporate accounts were mysteriously frozen. I settled aggressive debts with lumber suppliers who were days away from filing liens against his properties. Most horrifying of all, I executed massive emergency cash injections to pad his corporate accounts just hours before the banks could trigger an automatic default on his commercial credit lines. I bled my own hard-earned corporate wealth dry, liquidating my stock options and bonuses, purely to ensure the Woodward name never suffered a public blemish. And then there was Nolan, my charming, handsome younger brother. The local business journals hailed him as a prodigy, a young man with a rare instinctual genius for the modern real estate market. Reading those articles made me physically nauseous. Nolan did not possess a single shred of business instinct. What Nolan possessed was a password to my secure servers. For the past 4 years, every brilliant pitch he made to venture capitalists was stolen. The sophisticated cost allocation models he presented to the city council, the risk analysis dashboards he used to secure municipal funding, every single data point, every predictive graph, every structured financial argument was built line by me. I coded those dashboards over agonizing weekends while Nolan was out sailing. He simply took my algorithms, slapped the Woodward Heritage Build logo over my watermarks, and stood in boardrooms soaking up the applause. I once sat in the back of a municipal planning meeting, entirely unacknowledged, while Nolan pointed confidently at a massive projection screen. He explained the complex financial buffers required for a waterfront restoration, using the exact phrasing I had written in an email to him the night before. The city awarded him a contract worth $7 million that afternoon. He did not even buy me a cup of coffee to say thank you. He just bought himself a new sports car. Why did I do it? Why did I pour years of my life and millions of dollars into a black hole of ungratefulness? It was not stupidity. I was a woman who could calculate the failure rate of a seawall down to a fraction of a percent. I knew exactly what a terrible investment my family was. The psychological trap that held me hostage was far more insidious. It was the pathetic, gnawing starvation for validation. I was trapped in a cage built for my own desperate childhood need to be seen. I truly believed that if I was just smart enough, if I made myself undeniably useful, if I proved my absolute, unbreakable loyalty, they would eventually look at me and see a daughter and a sister, rather than a walking ATM with the Woodward surname. I thought my competence could purchase my humanity in their eyes. A single, rare nod of approval from my father over a salvaged quarterly report was enough to sustain me for months. A family dinner where the passive-aggressive remarks were kept to a minimum felt like a victory. A fleeting afternoon where Nolan asked for my advice without his usual mocking undertone was enough to make me authorize another massive wire transfer the very next morning to cover his reckless overdrafts. I was paying a ransom every single day, trying to buy back a family that fundamentally did not want to be rescued by me. But tonight, on the 23rd of December, the delicate, pathetic illusion I had built my life around completely shattered. As I closed the door to my bedroom and leaned against the heavy wood, my father's sentence echoed in my mind with brutal clarity. He had looked me dead in the eye and offered his purest truth. In that singular moment of breathtaking cruelty, he had finally set me free. The agonizing realization washed over me. Cold and absolute, I was not holding this family together. I was actively subsidizing their contempt for me. I was financing my own daily humiliation. They did not love me for saving them. They hated me because my constant, invisible bailouts were a silent reminder of their own profound incompetence. I walked over to my desk, my mind clearer and sharper than it had been in a decade. They wanted the gift of my absence. They genuinely believed the empire they stood upon was built of their own greatness. Rather than my endless sacrifices, it was time to stop paying the ransom. It was time to show them exactly what the Woodward legacy looked like without the risk architect holding the walls up. I locked the heavy oak door of my bedroom and walked straight to my desk. My pulse was entirely steady, a slow, rhythmic drumbeat in my ears that felt like the marching of an army preparing for a siege. I opened my personal laptop. The screen woke, casting a pale, clinical blue light across my face in the darkened room. I opened a master spreadsheet I had maintained for the better part of a decade. The file name was deliberately boring. designed to be overlooked if anyone ever breached my system household continuity. It was a massive, intricate digital web. It contained automated bank transfers, collateral holds, escrow agreements, and shadow lines of credit. It was the true nervous system of the Woodward Empire, and tonight, I was going to perform a meticulous, bloodless dissection. I started with the immediate future. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve, and the Grand Charity Gala was the social event of the season in Ashby Harbor. The vendors were expecting their final financial clearances by midnight tonight to proceed with the installations. I navigated to the floral account. The invoice was for $32,000 for imported white winter roses, orchids, and custom centerpieces. The payment source was linked to my secondary limited liability company. I did not call the florist to cancel the order. I simply clicked a button, changing the payment status from guaranteed to insufficient funds. I merely removed my backing. Let Everett pay for the extravagant flowers with his own overdrawn accounts. Next was the entertainment, a premier string quartet from Charleston. $4,500. I disabled the autopay function. The rare wine and champagne supplier, $18,000. I revoked the credit authorization, freezing the account. The black car service for the VIP politicians and wealthy donors, $12,000. I released the escrow funds back into my private offshore account. Then came the event liability insurance. A gala of this magnitude required massive coverage, especially when serving alcohol to city officials. I navigated to the broker's portal and simply let the midnight renewal deadline pass without hitting the green button. If a guest slipped on the marble stairs tomorrow night, or if a candle caught a silk drape on fire, Everett Woodward would be personally liable for tens of millions of dollars. I was not destroying his party. I was just refusing to be his private fire department anymore, with the gala handled. I moved to the heavy machinery, the corporate side of Woodward Heritage Build. I logged into their primary banking portal. I possessed absolute administrative access, purely because I had engineered their entire debt structure to keep them out of federal bankruptcy court. There was a standing digital order to automatically transfer funds from my accounts whenever their commercial credit line dipped below the mandatory minimum of $250,000. I highlighted the standing order. I pressed delete. It vanished. By noon tomorrow, the bank's automated compliance system would flag the severe deficit and freeze all of their operating accounts. I executed the exact same protocol for the property taxes and the exorbitant monthly maintenance retainer for Magnolia Row. I canceled the direct debits for the landscaping crews, the pool maintenance, the antique specialists, and the private security firm. I severed the financial arteries one by one. Each click of my mouse was a quiet, sharp cut. I felt no rage. I felt only the cold, precise satisfaction of an engineer dismantling a faulty machine. Next was Nolan, my brilliant, visionary brother. I accessed the secure, encrypted cloud server where I hosted the coastal risk assessment models. This dashboard was the engine of his entire fraudulent persona. It was the tool he used to mesmerize investors and secure municipal grants. I opened the master user directory and located his username. His access level was currently set to full download, edit, and presentation privileges. With 2 deliberate keystrokes, I changed his permissions. Access denied. I then initiated a remote wipe of the cached data on his personal devices. The next time he tried to open the dashboard to impress a venture capitalist or a city planner with his fake genius, he would be greeted by a blank, gray screen. His intellectual lifeline was officially cut. I opened a blank text document. I ran a custom macro on my ledger to calculate the exact, finalized sum of money I had injected into the Woodward family and their failing enterprises over the last 7 years. The software took a few seconds to compile the data from dozens of hidden accounts. The final number appeared on the screen. Staggering and grotesque. It was the price of a small country estate or a private island. I typed the number in a bold, black font, centering it on the page. $4,872,515. Beneath that massive, undeniable figure, I typed a single, crisp sentence. If I vanish, so does the subsidy. I hit print. The laser printer in the corner of my room whirred to life, spitting out the single sheet of paper. I moved to my closet to pack. I pulled down a single, scuffed leather duffel bag. I did not pack the designer gowns Lenora had purchased to make me look presentable for their society photographs. I left the expensive shoes and the cashmere coats. I packed only my legal notebooks, my encrypted hard drives, and my work laptop. I opened the hidden wall safe behind my mirror. I extracted my passport, my corporate incorporation files, and a small, worn velvet box containing my biological mother's sapphire earrings. I took absolutely nothing that was purchased with Woodward money. I wanted no part of their rot. My bag was incredibly light, containing only the absolute necessities of my own engineered survival. Before I closed my laptop for the final time, I drafted one last, highly classified email. It was addressed to Marcus Thorne, a ruthless, discreet commercial real estate broker based in Atlanta. We had a contingency contract on file for Magnolia Row, signed during a particularly desperate period 2 years ago when Everett almost lost the title to the bank. I typed a brief, coded instruction. Activate the default clause. The property will breach its financial covenants by tomorrow evening. Prepare the listing. I hit send. It was nearly 4 a.m. I slung the leather bag over my shoulder and picked up the printed sheet of paper. I unlocked my bedroom door and walked down the grand sweeping staircase. My soft-soled shoes made absolutely no sound against the polished mahogany. The massive house was dead quiet, heavy with the artificial, suffocating scent of wealth and pine. I walked into the pristine, industrial-grade kitchen. I took a simple magnet and pinned the single sheet of paper to the direct center of the stainless steel refrigerator door. It was impossible to miss. I stepped out through the side utility door into the massive garage. I unlocked my modest sedan. I did not turn on the headlights until I had rolled entirely down the long, winding gravel driveway. The heavy wrought iron gates of Magnolia Row opened silently for me one last time. I pulled out onto the dark coastal highway. The humid South Carolina fog was rolling in thick off the Atlantic Ocean, swallowing the rearview mirror in a blanket of gray. I did not look back. For the first time in my entire adult life, the profound silence inside the car did not feel like a suffocating loneliness. It felt like pure, magnificent control. By 8 o'clock on the morning of the 24th of December, the damp chill of the riverfront had seeped through the thin window panes of my rented room at the Mariner Inn. It was a bleak, anonymous motel miles away from the manicured lawns and sweeping oaks of my former life. I sat at a rickety laminate desk, a stark contrast to the antique mahogany I was used to, nursing a cup of bitter black coffee. The screen of my laptop was the only source of light I needed. Last night was about severing the physical and immediate financial ties. This morning was about performing a forensic autopsy on my own life. I needed to ensure there were no lingering parasitic threads attached to my private limited liability company before the banks opened. I initiated a deep-level audit of my corporate credit files using a localized instance of my risk evaluation software. My fingers flew across the keyboard, running standard deviation checks and matching security logs. For the first hour, everything looked exactly as I had left it: frozen, canceled, or safely diverted back to my private holding accounts. But then, a severe red flag tripped on the secondary ledger. It was a massive, glaring anomaly hidden beneath layers of obfuscated code. A commercial emergency bridge loan had been executed 3 weeks prior. The principal amount was $480,000. My breath caught in my throat, hot and sharp. I had never authorized a loan of that magnitude under my personal holding company. I pulled up the digitized loan origination documents, my eyes scanning the dense legal text. The lender was an aggressive second-tier private equity firm out of Charlotte, known for predatory interest rates. I scrolled rapidly to the final page of the PDF. There, sitting bold in black on the digital signature line, was my name. I checked the metadata. The security address logged for the electronic acceptance was routed directly through the primary router in the private study at Magnolia Row. It was a forgery. A highly sophisticated, legally binding felony committed under my own roof. I dug deeper, tracing the routing numbers attached to the loan disbursement. The $480,000 had not been used to cover household expenses or patch a minor operational leak in my father's failing company. The funds were parked in an escrow account specifically tied to a municipal bidding bond. It was the earnest money required to pitch for the Ashby Harbor Historic Train Station restoration. This was the exact mega-project my father had been aggressively lobbying for, the crowning jewel he planned to officially announce to the press, the politicians, and the wealthy donors at the Christmas Eve gala tonight. A cold, razor-sharp clarity washed over me. I opened the attached capability profile submitted to the City Council. Page after page of intricate risk analysis, load-bearing financial projections, and catastrophic weather buffers filled my screen. It was brilliant work. I knew it was brilliant because I had written every single line of code that generated it over the span of 2 agonizing years, but the header on the document did not bear my name. It was boldly titled as the Proprietary Forecasting System of Woodward Heritage Build, and the lead architect listed on the submission, the so-called visionary behind the mathematics, was Nolan Woodward. My father had not merely viewed me as an unlimited bank account, he was actively stealing my identity. He had forged my signature to secure nearly $500,000 of toxic debt in my name, and he was taking the intellectual property I built to launch his golden boy into the stratosphere. He was using my financial bones to build Nolan a throne, assuming I would remain too meek to ever audit the shadows he operated in. Suddenly, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the cheap laminate desk. It was a relentless, buzzing assault. Messages flooded the locked screen from aunts, uncles, and cousins I had not spoken to in months. I picked up the device and opened the first text from my Aunt Sylvia. "Reese, what on earth is going on? Your father just called. He says you're having some kind of episode. Please come home right now." Another from a distant cousin popped up immediately after. "Heard you threatened to ruin the Christmas party because you are jealous of Nolan getting the promotion. You really need to get psychiatric help. Reese, this is embarrassing." Everett had struck first. Knowing the financial guillotine I had set up the night before was about to drop on his accounts. He was frantically laying the groundwork for a counter-narrative. In his version of the story, I was not the architect of his survival who had finally walked away. I was a mentally unstable, bitter spinster throwing a catastrophic tantrum to ruin the holidays. He was discrediting me to the entire extended family before I could even speak a word in my own defense. The phone rang in my hand. It was Lenora. I let it ring 4 times, watching her name flash, before I finally pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear. "Reese, darling," Lenora said. Her voice was dripping with that practiced, soft-focused Southern concern. It was the exact tone she used when one of the maids broke a valuable vase. "Please tell me you are somewhere safe. Your father is simply beside himself with worry. The vendors are calling the house, saying their accounts are locked. You know how much stress his heart is under right now. Please, darling, do not make a massive, ugly deal out of a simple slip of the tongue at dinner. Come home, fix the accounts, and we can all pretend last night was just the wine talking." I listened to the absolute, staggering delusion in her voice. She genuinely believed my profound humiliation was merely a minor inconvenience, something that could be patched over with cheap sentiment and a demand for my immediate compliance. "It was not a slip of the tongue, Lenora," I said, my voice flat and steady. "And I am not here to clean up his mess anymore. Tell Everett to check the signature logs on the train station bid." I hung up the phone and powered the device down completely. Tossing it onto the bed, the family drama was over. This was now a legal and financial fight, and I needed someone who knew how to finish it. I reached into my leather duffel bag and pulled out my heavily encrypted burner phone. I dialed a number I had kept memorized for 5 years, always praying I would never actually need to use it. "Mara Sloan," a sharp, clipped voice answered on the second ring. Mara was a forensic financial attorney based in Atlanta. She was a ghost in the corporate world, entirely devoid of mercy, famous for dissecting paper fraud and burying corrupt executives so deep under federal charges that they never saw a boardroom again. Mara, it is Reese Woodward. I need to activate our emergency retainer. I have a forged commercial bridge loan for $480,000, major intellectual property theft tied to a municipal bid, and I need you to start unraveling Woodward Heritage Build before tonight's gala. Send me the raw data package, Mara replied instantly, not wasting a single breath on pleasantries or sympathy. I will need full administrative access to their primary ledger. I forwarded the heavily encrypted files directly to her secure server. For the next 3 hours, I sat in absolute silence, watching the heavy tugboats churn the muddy river water outside my window. The emotional weight of my family's betrayal had completely evaporated, replaced by the icy, intoxicating thrill of a pending prosecution. I was no longer a victim. I was a hunter mapping the terrain. Just before noon, my encrypted phone chimed. It was Mara. "Reese, your father is much worse than incompetent. He is criminally arrogant," Mara said, the faint sound of rapid typing echoing in the background. "I bypassed his shadow accounts. The forged loan is actually the least of your problems." "What did you find?" I asked, leaning closer to the desk, my pulse quickening. "The charitable sponsorships for tonight's gala. The city elites have been writing massive checks for months to the Woodward Heritage Foundation. I tracked the routing numbers on the clearing accounts. A massive portion of those donations never made it to the charity trust. They were funneled out through an offshore shell vendor registered as a historic preservation consultancy." "Let me guess," I said, my stomach twisting into a tight, hard knot. "The consultancy does not exist." "It does not. It is a financial black hole. But that is not his masterpiece," Mara continued, her voice devoid of any warmth. "The authorization signatures on the wire transfers to that shell company are not your father's. They are digitally stamped with your personal administrative credentials. He used the back-end access you gave him to run the gala payments. He has been siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars in charity funds to cover his private, unrecorded debts, and he engineered the entire digital paper trail to point directly at you." The room spun for a fraction of a second. The sheer malice of it took my breath away. If the municipal auditor, or worse, the federal authorities, looked into the missing gala funds, Everett was completely insulated. He had set up the perfect, watertight scapegoat. I was the one who managed the accounts. I was the one whose digital fingerprint was on the theft. He had not just asked for me to vanish. He had built a trapdoor to send me to federal prison so his golden boy could inherit a clean, unblemished empire. "Can you isolate the hardware addresses he used to spoof my credentials?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave into something unrecognizable. "I already have," Mara confirmed smoothly. "I have the hardware MAC address of his personal desktop computer in the Magnolia Row study. The evidence is absolutely bulletproof. What are your instructions?" I looked out the window at the heavy gray South Carolina sky. The time for quietly cutting the cord and walking away into the mist was dead. "Draft a formal notice of default and prepare the paperwork for a hostile creditor takeover," I instructed, every single word precise and lethal. "Do not file anything with the federal authorities just yet. I want the control first. We are going to buy his debt." This was no longer about walking away. It was about turning the stage they had built for themselves into a public legal reckoning. I left the Mariner Inn precisely at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, pulling my collar against the damp harbor wind. The investigative phase was over. It was time to gather the witnesses. I drove to a nondescript diner on the industrial edge of Ashby Harbor, a place where the waiters did not know the Woodward name and the coffee tasted like burnt copper. Sitting in the furthest booth, staring into a chipped mug, was June Halpern. June was a meticulous, sharp-minded woman in her late 50s who had served as the chief controller for Woodward Heritage Build until 8 months ago. Everett had unceremoniously fired her, claiming her accounting methods were outdated. I knew the truth. June was fired because she started asking questions that Everett could not afford to answer. I slid into the vinyl booth across from her. I did not offer pleasantries. I slid a manila folder across the sticky table. It contained the initial findings Mara and I had compiled that morning. "I am pulling the plug on them," June, I said softly, keeping my voice buried under the diner's ambient noise. I know about the inflated restoration invoices. I know you found them before he forced you out. I need the missing pieces. June looked at the folder, then up at me, her eyes hardened by months of professional exile. Your father told the board I was losing my edge. He ruined my reputation in this town to protect his golden boy. You want the missing pieces? Reese. I brought the whole puzzle. She reached into her oversized leather tote and produced a sleek silver flash drive, placing it deliberately on top of my folder. Nolan is not just a fraud, June said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He is a liability. For the past 2 years, he has been taking those pristine risk models you built to secure massive municipal contracts. The city planners look at the math, see a guaranteed safeguard against budget overruns, and approve the bids. But the second the ink dries, Nolan shreds the operational budget. I leaned in, feeling the cold, familiar grip of forensic accounting taking over my senses. How exactly is he bleeding the projects? He inflates the material costs by 40%, June explained, her finger tapping the silver drive. He pads the union labor hours on days when the weather logs prove no one was on the site. Then, he funnels the excess capital through a network of shell vendors. They are all his frat brothers and country club buddies posing as specialized historical masonry consultants. It is a massive, systemic kickback scheme. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. And my father. Does Everett know the extent of the bleed, or is Nolan actually managing to hide this from him? June let out a bitter, humorless laugh. Everett knows everything. When I first caught the discrepancies on the waterfront pavilion project, I took the ledger directly to your father. I assumed Nolan was just being a reckless amateur. Everett looked me dead in the eye, told me it was the cost of doing business in a modern political landscape, and fired me the very next morning. I kept every single internal log, every hidden email thread, every contract edit, and screenshots of their private server directories before the security team walked me out of the building. It is all on that drive. Everett is not a victim of a rogue son. He is the architect of the cover-up. I took the flash drive, feeling its weight. This was the kill shot. I opened my laptop right there in the diner, plugging the drive in and bypassing the basic encryption June had applied. As I sorted through the massive data dump, a specific document caught my eye. It was titled with tonight's date, the 24th of December. It was the finalized draft of the speech Everett intended to deliver at the Christmas Eve gala. I opened the file and read the highlighted section. My blood turned to absolute ice. Tonight, Everett planned to stand in front of the city's elite and introduce Nolan not just as his successor, but as the sole creator of the proprietary risk analysis system. He was going to call my brother the architect of the city's future. They were taking the intellectual property I had bled over for years, the very system I had never legally licensed to them for public or commercial use, and they were going to crown Nolan with it under the glittering lights of the gala. I closed the laptop with a sharp snap. Thank you. June, buy a dress for tonight. You are coming to a party. My next call was significantly more dangerous. I sat in my parked car outside the diner and dialed the direct office line of Dahlia Voss. Dahlia was the senior procurement official for the city, a woman renowned for her absolute intolerance of bureaucratic nonsense. I knew she had been harboring quiet suspicions regarding the Woodward bids for the past 6 months, but Everett had always managed to dazzle the mayor just enough to keep her investigations at bay. Voss, she answered, her tone clipped and busy. Ms. Voss, this is Reese Woodward. I need exactly 4 minutes of your time, and I strongly suggest you do not hang up. There was a heavy pause on the line. I am listening. You have had reservations about the historic train station bid submitted by Woodward Heritage Build, I said, keeping my delivery rapid and devoid of emotion. Your instincts are entirely correct. The financial capability profile attached to that bid is built on stolen intellectual property, and the earnest money securing the contract was obtained through a forged commercial loan. I have the digital paper trail, the routing numbers, and the sworn testimony of their former controller to prove systemic municipal fraud. Why are you handing me your own family on a silver platter? Dahlia asked, her voice tight with suspicion. Because I am the one they stole the technology from, I replied smoothly. And because I refuse to go down with their ship, I am sending a secure data packet to your personal terminal right now. Review it. But I am asking you to hold your fire. Hold my fire if this data is verified. I am required to involve the federal authorities immediately. And you will, I countered. But I want you at the gala tonight. I want you to let Everett Woodward take the stage. Let him announce the train station project to the press. Let him publicly claim ownership of a system he does not possess. If you strike now, he will bury it in endless litigation and claim administrative errors. If you let him commit the fraud on a live microphone in front of his entire donor base, the empire dies tonight. Give him enough rope, Dahlia. A long, calculating silence stretched across the line. Finally, she exhaled sharply. I will be wearing a navy blue suit. Do not make me look like a fool. Reese, I disconnected the call. The board was set, but I needed an impenetrable fortress to launch my final strike from. I needed corporate leverage that even Everett could not talk his way out of. I drove straight to the glass and steel compound of Raven Peak Civic Systems in the downtown financial district. Raven Peak was a massive, aggressive infrastructure technology firm. They were the undisputed apex predators of urban development software, and for the past 8 months, they had been aggressively trying to headhunt me away from my firm. They wanted my predictive models. Today, I was finally ready to sell. I bypassed the reception desk and walked directly into the glass-walled conference room of their executive vice president. I did not ask for a seat. I stood at the head of the polished oak table and opened my laptop, projecting my core source code onto the massive display screen. I am ready to sign the exclusivity agreement, I announced to the startled executives. But the terms have fundamentally changed. I am not just joining your firm. I am selling you the absolute, exclusive rights to my entire urban risk analysis platform. The same platform Woodward Heritage Build is currently attempting to use to secure the train station contract. The moment I sign this document, their entire municipal bidding infrastructure becomes the legal property of Raven Peak, and they are operating in direct, actionable violation of international copyright. The vice president leaned forward, his eyes locked on the brilliant, flawless mathematics scrolling across the screen. He recognized the sheer power of the weapon I was handing him. What is your asking price, Reese? I want the director position of your new Civic Risk Systems division, I stated clearly, my voice ringing off the glass walls. I want full legal backing from your corporate litigation team starting precisely at 8 o'clock tonight. And I want your senior partners standing beside me when I walk into the Magnolia Row Gala. They drew up the contracts within the hour. I read every single clause, every stipulation, every transfer of intellectual property. When I finally dragged the heavy ink pen across the signature line, a profound, electric shift occurred deep within my bones. I was no longer the silent, invisible subsidy. I was no longer the exhausted daughter trying to buy love with bank transfers. When I walked into that ballroom, I would not be entering as the family scapegoat. I would be entering with the contracts, the capital, and the legal leverage they had spent years pretending I did not control. I no longer wanted to disappear quietly and let them collapse in private. I wanted the truth exposed where their reputation mattered most in front of the very people they had lied to. I had barely returned to the Mariner Inn at 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the heavy, aggressive pounding on my door started. It was not a polite knock, it was a demand, loud enough to rattle the cheap glass in the window pane. I knew exactly who it was. I had not bothered to disable the GPS tracking on my old family data plan before tossing the phone into my duffel bag. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Everett stood in the narrow exterior hallway, his face flushed with a dark, terrifying rage. The polished, aristocratic charm he wore for the public was completely gone, replaced by the ugly, raw entitlement of a man who had just been denied access to his favorite vault. Nolan was right behind him, pacing the concrete walkway like a caged, panicked animal. They pushed past me into the small, dimly lit room before I could even say a word. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" Everett bellowed, his voice vibrating off the thin motel walls. He did not offer a single word of apology for the horrific things he had said the night before. "My corporate cards are declining all over the city. The florists are refusing to deliver the centerpieces. The lighting crews are threatening to walk out. Guests are already calling my private line asking if there is a financial problem with the gala tonight. There is no financial problem with the gala, Father," I replied, my voice perfectly level and quiet, a stark contrast to his shouting. "You just have to pay for it yourself now." "Magnolia Row is the family home," he spat, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. The veins in his neck were standing out against his perfectly pressed collar. "The money you put into that house, the capital you injected into my company, that is the duty of a child. It is your fundamental obligation to this family. You do not just turn off the tap and throw a catastrophic tantrum like a spoiled teenager just because your feelings were hurt at dinner." I stared at him, feeling a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. He was inadvertently handing me exactly what I needed to hear. In his eyes, I was never an independent human being. I was never a professional architect of risk, nor a woman who had built her own wealth. I was merely an extension of his estate, a resource bound by blood to serve his vanity. The money was not a gift, nor a lifeline. To him, it was a tax I owed simply for carrying his last name. Nolan stepped out from behind our father's shadow, his face twisted into an ugly sneer. "We are going to sue you, Reese," he threatened, jabbing his finger in the air. "You locked me out of my own operational data. You are actively attempting to steal the family's business opportunity with the historic train station bid. You think you are so brilliant, but you only secured your fancy job at Alder Axis Risk because you used the Woodward name to climb the ladder. You owe us. You are absolutely nothing without this family backing you." The sheer, staggering audacity of his delusion was almost impressive. Nolan actually believed his own fabricated reality. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue the facts. I simply walked over to the door and held it wide open. "Get out before I call the local police and have you both escorted off the property for trespassing," I said coldly. Everett straightened his jacket, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You are making a mistake you will never recover from, Reese. You are burning your only bridge." He turned and marched out the door, Nolan trailing closely behind him, muttering curses under his breath. I closed the door and locked the deadbolt, leaning my forehead against the cool wood. My hands were shaking slightly. It was not from fear, but from the massive adrenaline crash. 30 minutes later, there was another knock. This time, it was soft and hesitant. I checked the peephole and saw Lenora standing alone in the damp corridor. She was holding a faded, velvet-covered cardboard box. I reluctantly opened the door. "Please, Reese," Lenora pleaded softly, stepping into the room and carefully placing the box on the edge of the mattress. Her eyes were wide and filled with practiced, sorrowful tears. "Your father is under so much tremendous pressure right now. You know how his pride works. He says terrible things he does not mean when he feels cornered. Look what I brought for you." She opened the lid of the box. Nestled in the yellowed tissue paper were my biological mother's antique glass Christmas angels. We used to hang them on the tree together when I was a very little girl, long before Lenora had moved into Magnolia Row. "Do not throw your entire family away over a misunderstanding," Lenora whispered, reaching out to touch my arm with a gentle, motherly grace that felt entirely weaponized. "Come back to the house with me right now. Turn the vendor accounts back on. We can fix all of this before the first guests arrive. We can just be a family again." For a dangerous, agonizing moment, the little girl buried deep inside me hesitated. The sight of those fragile glass angels brought a violent rush of memories, a desperate longing for the mother I had lost and the father I had spent my entire life trying to impress. The suffocating cage of the Woodward family was undeniably painful, but it was familiar. It was known territory. Standing completely alone in a cheap motel room, preparing to incinerate my own legacy, was terrifying. I looked at the phone on the desk. All it would take was one call to the bank to release the funds. I almost wavered. I almost surrendered to the desperate hope that maybe, if I saved them just one last time, they would finally love me. But as Lenora hovered near the bed, waiting eagerly for my compliance, my eyes caught sight of a thick piece of folded cardstock wedged beneath the layers of tissue paper in the box. I reached out and pulled it free. It was a misplaced, advanced copy of the seating chart and the drafted commemorative program for tonight's gala. I opened the heavy paper. My name was completely absent from the seating arrangements. But it was the interior text that made the breath catch in my throat. The section of the program detailing the history of the Foundation's financial contributors had been entirely rewritten. Every single massive donation I had made, every financial disaster I had quietly averted with my own capital, was explicitly credited to the Woodward Family Trust. Worse, right there on the second page in bold print, Nolan was officially listed as the lead strategic design thinker of the new Urban Development Initiative. They were not just taking my money anymore. They were actively erasing my historical existence to build a monument to themselves. The spell instantly broke. The ghosts of my childhood vanished, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard clarity. "Get out, Lenora," I whispered. My voice carried no anger, only an absolute, terrifying finality. She saw the open program in my hand, the color drained completely from her face. She did not try to argue or cry. She turned and hurried out the door, leaving the box of ornaments behind. As the door clicked shut, my encrypted phone vibrated on the desk. It was Mara. "I just intercepted the final draft of your father's speech from his executive assistant's outbox," Mara said, her tone sharp and urgent. "Reese, he is not just going to announce Nolan tonight. He is preparing to publicly bury you." She pushed the file to my laptop. I opened the document and read the highlighted text. Everett planned to stand on the grand stage and express his deep, fatherly sorrow that his daughter had chosen to abandon the family business during their most crucial hour of expansion. He was going to cite my supposedly fragile mental state and erratic behavior, using my deliberate absence tonight to garner sympathy from the crowd. He was going to completely destroy my professional reputation with the local elite before I ever had a chance to defend myself. Simultaneously, a high-priority alert popped up on my screen. It was a notification from the deep archive server sync I had initiated earlier that morning. An old, deleted voicemail from 2 years ago had been recovered from the corporate server's backup drive. I clicked play. It was Everett, leaving an irritated message for his private commercial banker. "Look, I know Reese is the primary guarantor on the account." Everett's recorded voice echoed from the laptop speakers, sounding annoyed and infinitely arrogant. "Just push the damn loan paperwork through the system today." I signed whatever needed signing on her behalf. Her money in this house is the house's money. She does not need to know the complex details of the leverage. Just get the credit line extended by the close of business. The audio file ended, leaving a heavy, profound silence in the motel room. For 34 years, I had constantly asked myself if my father truly loved me. I had bent over backward, drained my personal bank accounts, and sacrificed my own professional identity just to earn a meager place at his grand table. But sitting in that cheap room, looking at the forged documents, the erased gala program, and the vicious, calculated speech he planned to deliver, the question fundamentally changed. I no longer wondered if my family loved me. The only question left in my mind was how much more of my flesh would they consume if I went back to clean up their ruins one more time. The answer was absolute. They would take everything. They would drain my accounts, steal my intellect, forge my name, and then stand on my grave to ask the crowd for applause. I closed the laptop and placed it carefully into my leather bag. The fear of being alone was completely gone, burned away by the undeniable truth. I was no longer a dutiful daughter debating whether to return to her cage. I was the architect of their survival, and I was about to show them exactly what structural collapse looked like. I sat in the dim light of the motel room, staring at the digital copies of my forged signature. I could have walked into the local police precinct right then, handed them the drive, and let the authorities arrest my father before the gala even began. It would have been loud, messy, and immediately destructive. But a sudden, explosive arrest was too easy. It would allow Everett to play the martyr. He would tell the press he was a victim of a sudden corporate misunderstanding, or worse, blame his downfall on a vindictive daughter trying to ruin the holidays. I did not just want to punish him. I wanted to completely dismantle his authority. I wanted to seize the very ground he stood on. I called Mara back. "Cancel the default notices," I told her, my voice ringing with a new, sharper clarity. "If we just blow the whistle on the fraud, the federal regulators will freeze everything. The assets will be tied up in litigation for a decade, and Everett will spend those 10 years spinning a narrative about how he was wronged. I do not want to destroy the chessboard. Mara, I want to own it." "Explain your angle, Reese," Mara replied, her tone shifting from aggressive to highly intrigued. "Everett secured the earnest money for the train station bid through a predatory bridge loan, using my name as the guarantor," I said, mapping out the architecture of my plan. "But that is not his only toxic debt. He has secondary bridge loans attached directly to the deed of Magnolia Row and the operational accounts of Woodward Heritage Build. If we buy those specific debt portfolios from his private equity lenders right now, I am no longer just a victim of his forgery. I become his primary, controlling creditor. I will have absolute, legally binding authority over his assets, his cash flow, and his real estate." Mara let out a low, appreciative breath over the line. A hostile creditor takeover from inside the house. "It is brilliant, Reese, but acquiring those debt portfolios before the holiday banking freeze will require a massive, instantaneous injection of liquid capital. We are talking millions of dollars in cash, wired within the next few hours." "I have the capital," I assured her. I immediately initiated a secure video conference with the senior partners at Raven Peak Civic Systems. I had just signed over the exclusive rights to my platform, but I needed them to act as my private bank for the next 12 hours. "I need you to underwrite a corporate debt buyout," I told the Raven Peak vice president, staring directly into the camera. "Woodward Heritage Build is heavily leveraged with second-tier lenders. I want Raven Peak to front the cash to purchase those specific bridge loans, transferring the controlling creditor position directly to my newly formed holding company. In exchange for underwriting this maneuver, I will amend our agreement. You will not just get my services as a director. Raven Peak will receive a permanent, royalty-free, exclusive license to my entire algorithmic risk platform after the fallout settles." The executives did not even mute their microphones to discuss it. They knew the municipal contracts my algorithms could win them were worth 10 times the cost of Everett's bad debt. "We will wire the funds to your attorney's escrow account immediately," the vice president confirmed. With the financial artillery secured, I turned my attention to the collateral damage. My family was toxic, but the company itself employed dozens of decent, hard-working people who had absolutely no idea their CEO was running a shell game. There were receptionists, logistics coordinators, low-level accountants, and field technicians who relied on those paychecks to feed their families, especially on Christmas Eve. I refused to let Everett's arrogance crush them. I opened my private ledger and carved out a highly protected shadow escrow account. I funded it with enough of my own clean capital to cover 3 full months of payroll and severance for every innocent employee on the Woodward roster. When the hammer dropped tonight, their livelihoods would be entirely insulated from the blast radius. The pieces were moving rapidly across the board. I checked in with my allies. June Halpern texted me from a boutique downtown. She had purchased a sharp black dress and had her sworn testimony, backed by the digital logs, printed and notarized. Dahlia Voss sent a brief, encrypted message confirming she had drafted the official municipal suspension notice for the train station bid, ready to be served the moment Everett attempted to publicly claim the project. To ensure the narrative could not be twisted by my father's spin doctors, I made one anonymous phone call to Silas Vance, a sharp, cynical investigative reporter for the city's largest newspaper. I tipped him off that tonight's Woodward Gala would feature the most significant, unprecedented heritage announcement of the holiday season, guaranteeing he would be standing in the ballroom with his recorder running. But my ultimate masterstroke was reserved for Magnolia Row. The sprawling historic estate was my father's greatest point of pride, his ultimate stage. He used it to project an illusion of aristocratic permanence. I contacted Marcus Thorne, my discreet real estate broker in Atlanta, and authorized the absolute final contingency plan. "Sell the estate," I commanded. "Reese, it is the 24th of December," Marcus argued, his voice tight with stress. "The market is frozen. To push a sale through today, we need a cash buyer willing to bypass standard inspections." "We already have the buyer on file," I reminded him. "Contact the Ashby Harbor Resilience Trust." The trust was a massive, well-funded nonprofit organization dedicated to coastal preservation and disaster management. For years, they had been quietly looking for a historic property to convert into a regional storm response training center, a legal aid clinic, and a community archive. Turning my father's vain exclusionary palace into a functional public utility designed to actually protect the city was the perfect, poetic reallocation of power. It was no longer about hurting my family. It was about taking the resources I had bled to save and forcing them to serve a purpose greater than Everett Woodward's ego. "I will contact the trust immediately," Marcus said. "But the sale is strictly contingent on you holding the controlling debt. If you do not possess the legal authority to force the sale over your father's objections, the trust will not wire the purchase funds." "Just get the contracts drawn," I replied. The authority is coming. Everything now hinged on a brutal race against the clock. It was early afternoon. The federal wire system and the private equity banks would initiate their strict holiday shutdown procedures at precisely 5 o'clock. I had to ensure Mara successfully purchased the bridge loans and transferred the creditor rights to my name before the banking window slammed shut. If the wires bounced, or if a compliance officer delayed the transfer until after the holiday, Everett would retain control of the estate, and my entire strategy would disintegrate. I sat in the motel room, watching the digital clock on my laptop screen tick down the seconds. The tension in my jaw was a physical ache. Every minute felt like an hour. I was racing against the banking algorithms, the setting sun, and the grand gala that was currently being assembled downtown. At exactly 4 minutes past 4 o'clock, my encrypted phone lit up with a secure notification from Mara. I opened the message with a held breath. It was a confirmed wire receipt from the banking system. The transfer from Raven Peak had cleared, the private equity firms had accepted the buyout, and the debt tied to Woodward Heritage Build and Magnolia Row had officially been transferred. I exhaled a long, shaky breath. Leaning back in the cheap desk chair, the adrenaline rush was replaced by a profound, terrifying calm. I was no longer a victim scrambling for survival. I was the absolute, indisputable owner of my family's ruin. The traps were set, the witnesses were gathered, and the stage was perfectly rigged. All that remained was to put on the dress, walk into the ballroom, and watch them light the match themselves. While I sat in my anonymous motel room securing the financial kill switch, the grand facade of the Woodward legacy was quietly fracturing across the city. Throughout the 24th of December, Magnolia Row descended into a state of silent, paralyzed chaos. The first cracks appeared shortly after dawn. The $32,000 worth of imported white winter roses never made it past the iron gates. The florists simply turned their delivery vans around when the automated clearinghouse rejected their final invoices. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the premier string quartet from Charleston officially canceled their appearance, refusing to board their transport without the cleared escrow deposit. The rare wine purveyors arrived at the estate, but flatly refused to unload the crates of vintage champagne. Holding the entire inventory hostage on their loading docks after the vendor credit lines flashed red. Every single contractor who had previously operated on the unspoken, golden promise of the Woodward name suddenly began demanding immediate certified cash payments. My father could not allow his wealthy donors, the city council, and the local press to step into a barren, silent house stripped of its extravagant armor. Running purely on the fumes of his own arrogance and decades of manufactured prestige, Everett initiated a frantic, last-minute pivot. He leveraged every ounce of his remaining social capital to secure the grand ballroom at the historic Beaumont Hotel in the center of the city. It was a desperate, bleeding maneuver, bought with frantic phone calls, personal guarantees, and handshakes he could no longer financially honor, just to keep the illusion alive for a few more hours. To the outside world, he remained the untouchable, elegant Everett Woodward. As the afternoon bled into the early evening, I watched a brief local news segment streamed on my laptop. He was standing in the opulent lobby of the Beaumont Hotel, wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, his posture impeccably straight. He spoke to the reporter in that rich, warm baritone, spinning poetic, practiced phrases about tradition, historical preservation, and urban recovery after storms. He looked exactly like a titan of industry. But staring at the digital screen, I felt no anger, only a cold, clinical pity. I saw a hollow shell of a man, an emperor parading in imaginary silk. He was standing upright solely because of the very pillars he had insulted the night before, foolishly believing he could easily replace the foundation he had just shattered. Meanwhile, according to a panicked, intercepted email from the corporate servers that Mara forwarded to me, Nolan was locked in a private suite on the top floor of the hotel, obsessively rehearsing his keynote presentation. He was pacing the plush carpet, memorizing lines and practicing his dramatic pauses. He was reciting the exact phrasing, word for perfect word, taken almost verbatim from a highly classified strategic risk memo I had drafted for a federal maritime partner 3 years ago. He was wrapping his tongue around my intellect, preparing to present my architectural genius as his own natural business instinct. As the sun finally set over the harbor, casting long, bruised shadows across the water, my burner phone buzzed against the laminate desk. It was a single text message from Lenora. I stared at the glowing screen. "Come home, and we can still make tonight look normal." I read the sentence 3 times. It was a masterpiece of desperate, quiet manipulation, but it possessed zero power over me now. The words clarified absolutely everything. They never wanted to fix their mistakes. They never wanted to apologize for the cruelty, the blatant theft, or the staggering, years-long exploitation. They simply wanted to normalize it. They wanted the silent machine to start working again, so they did not have to look at the rust and the rot underneath. To them, normal meant my endless subjugation. I deleted the message and powered the device down. It was time to get ready. I did not wear the emerald silk gown Lenora had aggressively selected for me months ago to match the floral arrangements. Instead, I pulled a simple, razor-sharp black suit from my leather duffel bag. It was the exact suit I wore to federal arbitration hearings, a garment designed for corporate warfare, not a society celebration. The fabric was heavy and structured, devoid of any decorative warmth. I fastened the buttons, securing the armor against my skin. I pulled my hair back into a severe, sleek knot at the base of my neck. I reached into the small velvet box I had taken from my hidden wall safe and retrieved my biological mother's sapphire ring. I slid the heavy, cold stone onto my right index finger. It caught the dim motel light, emitting a hard, unyielding spark of dark blue. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening, Mara Sloan arrived at my door holding a thick, combination-locked leather briefcase. She did not offer a greeting as she unclasped the brass locks and laid a stack of heavily watermarked legal documents across the edge of the mattress. I picked up my favorite heavy ink pen and began to sign. I signed the debt transfer deeds. I signed the hostile creditor authorizations. I signed the binding financial agreements that effectively made me the absolute owner of every single liability Everett Woodward had desperately tried to outrun. When my pen lifted from the final signature line on the last page, Mara reviewed the ink, nodded sharply, and handed me a certified digital receipt from the Federal Banking Authority. The controlling creditor position was officially, irrevocably, mine. "The trap is fully armed, Reese," Mara said quietly, packing the documents back into her briefcase. "The moment he attempts to claim the municipal project on that stage, the legal snare snaps shut." I gathered my own legal portfolio and walked out of the Mariner Inn. The evening air was biting and crisp, smelling heavily of salt water and incoming winter rain. I drove my modest sedan toward the downtown district, navigating the glowing streetlights and the heavy holiday traffic. The Beaumont Hotel loomed ahead, a massive, imposing structure of illuminated stone and arched glass windows. Limousines and Blacktown cars were already lining the circular driveway, dropping off city council members, wealthy socialites, and municipal leaders dressed in their absolute best. I did not pull into the glittering valet line to have the doors opened for me. I navigated around the block and parked in the subterranean garage, 3 levels below the grand ballroom. The concrete walls were cold and silent, a stark contrast to the string music and laughter echoing somewhere above me. I walked toward the metal service elevators reserved for the catering staff and security personnel. I stopped in front of the reflective steel doors and took one deep, stabilizing breath, feeling the cool air fill my lungs completely. The scent of fear, the desperate need for validation, and the suffocating obligation that had clung to me for 34 years were entirely gone. I was wiped clean. I pressed the call button. The doors slid open. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ballroom level. I was not entering the room as a disgraced daughter returning to beg for a seat at the family table. I was walking through the side doors as the ultimate architect of the evening. I was the person holding the invisible strings, preparing to decide exactly who would be allowed to remain standing on the stage when this Christmas Eve was finally over. I stepped out of the service elevator and into the heavy velvet-draped corridor that flanked the grand ballroom of the Beaumont Hotel. The air here was entirely different from the sterile, concrete cold of the subterranean parking garage. It was thick, practically suffocating, perfumed with expensive oud, roasted meats, and the sharp, metallic tang of poured champagne. Through the slightly parted double doors, the gala was a blinding spectacle of manufactured perfection. A massive, ceiling-high winter pine dominated the far wall, dusted with artificial snow and wrapped in thousands of tiny, brilliant white lights. Above the sea of guests, massive, tiered crystal chandeliers cast a fractured, prismatic glow over the room, catching the iridescent sheen of silk evening gowns and the sharp satin lapels of custom tuxedos. It was a flawless, sprawling painting of Ashby Harbor high society, a carefully choreographed dance of wealthy patrons, municipal leaders, and hungry politicians flashing bright, empty smiles over the rims of crystal flutes. I remained hidden in the recessed alcove near the main exit, a silent observer in my severe black suit, watching the architect of this grand illusion work his crowd. Everett was in his absolute element. He moved from table to table with the smooth, practiced grace of a seasoned politician on the eve of a guaranteed election victory. I watched him clasp the hand of the city mayor, clapping the man heartily on the shoulder before leaning in to whisper a joke that made the surrounding sycophants roar with polite laughter. He was weaving his narrative, regaling the old money families with heavily embellished tales of our ancestors, projecting the image of an unbreakable, multi-generational dynasty intrinsically tied to the very bedrock of the city. He was the undisputed king of the ballroom, insulated by the very people whose money he was actively siphoning to keep his sinking ship afloat. At the very center of the room, seated at the sprawling head table reserved for the Woodward family and elite dignitaries, was Nolan. He was practically vibrating with a smug, unearned confidence. He swirled amber liquid in a heavy crystal tumbler, leaning back in his velvet-upholstered chair as if he already held the deed to the entire hotel. He was dressed in a sharp midnight blue tuxedo, holding court with a group of young, easily impressed venture capitalists. He looked exactly like a man who believed tonight was nothing more than a lavish coronation, the final, glorious step before he officially assumed the mantle as the visionary face of a new corporate era. He had no idea he was sitting directly on top of a live minefield that I had armed hours ago. My eyes drifted slightly to the left of Nolan, tracing the edge of the head table. There, positioned perfectly between Lenora and a prominent city councilwoman, was a single, empty chair. A pristine white place card rested precisely in the center of the gold-rimmed charger plate. From my vantage point, I could clearly read my own name written in elegant, looping calligraphy. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Everett had not left that chair empty out of hope that I would arrive, nor to honor my place in the family. He had placed it there as a deliberate, highly visible prop. It was a silent, theatrical beacon designed to invite whispers, a subtle way to remind every single influential person in that room that his troublesome, mentally fragile daughter simply did not possess the fortitude to appear and support her family on their most important night. It was the physical manifestation of his impending smear campaign. The low hum of conversation faded into a hushed, respectful silence as a sharp chime echoed through the sophisticated sound system. The overhead chandeliers dimmed to a warm, amber glow, leaving only the main stage bathed in brilliant, unforgiving white light. Everett ascended the carpeted steps with the vigorous, confident stride of a man half his age. He adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of upturned faces with a practiced expression of deep, paternal warmth. Distinguished guests, beloved friends, and the esteemed leaders of Ashby Harbor, Everett began, his voice rolling over the crowd like dark velvet. Tonight, we do not simply gather to celebrate the holiday season. We gather to celebrate resilience. We gather to honor the history that built this magnificent city, and the unwavering dedication required to preserve its future. He paused perfectly, allowing the warm applause to wash over him before raising a hand to quiet the room. He leaned slightly closer to the microphone, his tone dropping into something more intimate, more dangerously sharp. Building a legacy is not for the faint of heart. It demands sacrifice. It demands an understanding of the profound value of bloodline, of heritage, and of absolute, unquestioning loyalty. He let the word loyalty hang in the air, a heavy, weighted stone. As he spoke, I slowly stepped out from the shadowed alcove, moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with the two senior executive vice presidents from Raven Peak Civic Systems, who had quietly slipped in through the lobby doors minutes prior. We stood at the absolute back of the ballroom, a solid, immovable wall of dark suits. I did not move. I did not flinch. I simply let the dim light catch the hard, cold sapphire of my mother's ring on my right hand. It was Lenora who saw me first. She was seated at the head table, delicately sipping water, her eyes scanning the crowd with a hostess's trained vigilance. Her gaze swept past the back exit, darted away, and then snapped back with violent speed. Across the vast expanse of the ballroom, our eyes locked. In a fraction of a second, the blood completely drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling against the bright emerald silk of her gown. Her manicured hand gripped the edge of the table so tightly, her knuckles turned stark white. She knew. Looking at my rigid posture, looking at the corporate titans flanking me, she realized instantly that I had not come to apologize or to play my assigned role. Everett, completely blind to the silent panic unfolding at his own table, pressed on with his rehearsed script. He looked down at the empty chair beside his wife, shaking his head with a manufactured, sorrowful sigh that was entirely Oscar-worthy. Sadly, not everyone possesses the strength required to carry the weight of a legacy, Everett continued, his voice dripping with faux pity. There are those who buckle under the pressure of duty. Some people find that they are simply better at walking away when the true work begins. They are better at abandoning ship than they are at building one. A ripple of low, polite laughter and sympathetic murmurs cascaded through the front tables. The elite of Ashby Harbor nodded in agreement, fully absorbing the poison he was feeding them, secure in their belief that the Woodward patriarch was weathering a tragic family storm with quiet dignity. But tonight, Everett declared, his voice rising to a triumphant, booming crescendo as he gestured grandly toward the center table, where my brother sat beaming. We look to the future. We look to the brilliant minds ready to forge a new path for Woodward Heritage Build. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my absolute honor to transition this program to our strategic partnership update and to introduce the true architect of tomorrow. That was the cue. It was the exact, precise moment the trap was designed to spring. The stage lights abruptly shifted from warm white to a harsh, blinding crimson. The string quartet, cued to play a triumphant swell for Nolan's approach, remained dead silent. Instead of a soaring melody, a sharp, heavy electronic hum vibrated through the massive speakers, rattling the crystal on the tables. Every single oversized digital projection screen flanking the ballroom walls, which were supposed to display the grand Woodward Heritage Build logo, instantly flashed and went entirely pitch black. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the wealthy patrons shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, the sudden darkness swallowing their polished smiles and polite laughter. I did not wait for the confused whispers to turn into panic. With the two Raven Peak executives beside me, I pushed off the back wall and stepped into the center aisle. The sharp sound of my shoes on the polished floor cut through the silence of the ballroom. I walked straight toward the stage, my eyes locked on the fear finally breaking across my father's face, and I did not say a word. The massive digital projection screens flanking the grand ballroom did not remain black for long. When they finally flared back to life, flooding the room with a harsh, clinical blue light, they did not display the golden, aristocratic logo of Woodward Heritage Build. Instead, the screens were filled with dense, scrolling lines of raw architectural code and forensic metadata. I stood completely still at the end of the center aisle, watching the absolute confusion ripple through the wealthy crowd. On the primary screen directly behind my father, a massive, high-definition image of the historic train station bidding dossier appeared. The document was meticulously highlighted in bright yellow. Beside it, a second window opened, displaying the core developmental ID tag embedded deep within the software's architecture. The ID bore my full name. Beneath that undeniable proof of authorship, Mara Sloan had compiled a pristine, irrefutable access log. It clearly showed Nolan's IP address, the exact timestamps of his unauthorized data duplication, and the hidden digital keystrokes he had used to hastily scrub my watermarks and replace them with his own. A heavy, suffocating murmur swept through the front tables. The venture capitalists who had been toasting Nolan's genius only moments ago now stared at the screens in stunned, horrified silence. Before Everett could even fully turn around to comprehend the towering digital evidence of his son's intellectual theft, the slides shifted. The room was hit with a rapid-fire succession of financial slaughter. First came the side-by-side forensic comparison of the commercial bridge loan. On the left was my actual, verified electronic signature. On the right was the forgery, complete with the undeniable geolocation stamp proving the fraudulent authorization had been executed directly from the primary router inside the private study of Magnolia Row. Next, the screens displayed the internal clearing accounts for the very gala these elites were currently attending. Red arrows traced the massive flow of their charitable donations moving away from the Woodward Heritage Foundation and pouring directly into an offshore shell vendor masked as a preservation consultancy. Then, the final, devastating blow fell from the ceiling speakers. The audio file of Everett's recovered voicemail echoed through the cavernous ballroom, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. His arrogant, impatient voice was unmistakable. "Just push the damn loan paperwork through the system today. I signed whatever needed signing on her behalf. Her money in this house is the house's money." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a dynasty instantly vaporizing. I signaled the Raven Peak executive standing beside me. The senior vice president stepped forward, his voice cutting through the heavy air with practiced, corporate authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I represent Raven Peak Civic Systems," he announced clearly. "We are honored to officially welcome Reese Woodward as the new director of our Civic Risk Systems Division. I also need to clarify that the predictive technology used in the Woodward Heritage Build municipal proposals was never licensed for their commercial use. That technology is now the exclusive intellectual property of Raven Peak. and any further use of it will be treated as actionable intellectual property infringement. From the center of the room, Dahlia Voss slowly stood up. Her navy blue suit was perfectly pressed, her expression entirely devoid of mercy. She did not need a microphone. Her voice carried the sharp ring of municipal authority. As the senior procurement official for Ashby Harbor, I am hereby announcing the immediate, indefinite suspension of the historic train station project bid. Pending a full, multi-agency investigation into capability fraud and the forgery of municipal financial instruments, Woodward Heritage Build is stripped of its preferred contractor status. Panic finally broke out. Guests began whispering frantically, pulling out their phones. Realizing they were sitting in the middle of a massive federal crime scene, Everett's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged for the microphone stand, his hands shaking violently. "This is an outrage!" he bellowed, though his rich baritone now sounded thin and desperate. "This is a targeted, hysterical attack by a disturbed young woman who is trying to destroy her own family's legacy." Nolan jumped up from his chair, his face pale and slick with sweat. "You are ruining everything. Reese," he shouted across the tables, his voice cracking, "you are destroying our lives." But Mara Sloan stepped into Everett's path before he could reach the microphone. She did not raise her voice. She simply held up a thick leather portfolio containing the transfer documents and creditor filings. "Reese Woodward is not destroying your legacy, Everett," Mara stated, her words dropping like anvils onto the polished floor. "She owns it. As of 4 hours ago, Miss Woodward executed a hostile buyout of your primary bridge loans. She is the sole controlling creditor of Woodward Heritage Build and the Magnolia Row estate. And as her first act of asset management, she has successfully sold Magnolia Row to the Ashby Harbor Resilience Trust. The proceeds of this sale will be strictly prioritized to settle valid vendor debts and provide comprehensive severance for your innocent, defrauded employees. There will be no corporate bailout for your extravagant lifestyle." Everett stumbled back as if he had been physically struck. He looked around the room, his eyes wide and panicked, searching for an ally, a friendly politician, a loyal donor. He found nothing but cold, averted gazes, and the flashing cameras of the local press. From the shadows near the catering entrance, June Halpern stepped into the light. She looked directly at Everett, her posture rigid and proud. "I served as your controller for 6 years, Everett," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "And I have already handed every single internal audit log, every doctored invoice, and every hidden email directly to the federal authorities. It is over." No one in that grand, glittering room could pretend anymore. The illusion was shattered. I was no longer the bitter, invisible daughter they dismissed. I was the person who had finally stopped saving them. I finally walked toward the stage, stopping just a few feet away from where my father stood frozen in the wreckage of his own making. I looked at his perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair, and the utter emptiness in his eyes. "Last night, you looked across the dinner table and said this family would be better off without me," I said, my voice steady and calm. "So I stepped away, not from my life, Father, from the system that kept yours standing. Enjoy what is left of it." I turned my back on him and walked out of the ballroom. I did not run. I did not look back at the chaotic screaming that erupted as the reality of their bankruptcy set in. I simply walked out into the cold, clean winter air of Ashby Harbor, completely and utterly free. In the aftermath, the collapse was rapid and total. Woodward Heritage Build was subjected to a brutal, agonizing federal audit. Without my risk models to steal, Nolan's supposed genius evaporated instantly. He was entirely blacklisted from the commercial real estate sector before the spring thaw. Everett lost his social power faster than he ever thought possible. The politicians stopped returning his calls. The country club revoked his membership citing moral turpitude, and the federal indictments for wire fraud kept him buried in endless, humiliating litigation. I did not gloat. I did not grant interviews to the local papers. I simply went to work at Raven Peak, building a division that actually protected the coastline rather than exploiting it. Exactly 1 year later, during the next holiday season, I drove my car down the familiar coastal highway. I pulled through the open iron gates of the former Magnolia Row. The grand estate was unrecognizable in the best possible way. The oppressive antique furniture and the suffocating atmosphere of exclusivity were gone. The grand ballroom where my father had once mocked me was now a brightly lit community center filled with drafting tables, storm response training equipment, and local volunteers mapping floodplains. The house smelled of fresh paint, ocean breeze, and genuine purpose. I walked through the heavy mahogany doors, feeling the solid wood beneath my hand. For the first time in my entire life, standing inside those walls, I felt completely at peace. I finally understood the truth. The most beautiful, satisfying revenge was not about how much pain I could inflict upon them. The greatest revenge was realizing that I no longer had to pay the devastating price to belong to people who never deserved me in the first place. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below with your city or country so we can connect. If you enjoyed this journey of taking back control, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel. Hit the like button on this video, and do not forget to click the hype button so this story can reach and empower even more people who need to hear it.